long before men built their kingdoms, before dwarves carved their mountains, and before elves sang their songs, there was a nightmare, a tide of green flesh, red eyes, and endless hunger. They had no kings, no gods, no mercy. They had only war. These were the Orks, and this is the legend of their greatest warlord, Gorgrim Skullsplitter, the monster who united the tribes, drowned the world in blood, and gave birth to the first Wog. Before kingdoms rose and empires stretched their banners across the land, before kings carved their names into stone and elves sang their songs of beauty and sorrow, the world was young, wild, and untamed. Forests stretched for endless miles, thick and dark, their canopies blotting out the sun. Mountains clawed at the heavens, their peaks lost in storm and cloud. Rivers thundered through the valleys, carving paths like scars across the earth. Humanity lived in scattered tribes, little more than frightened sparks in the vast wilderness. They built huts of mud and timber, prayed to nameless gods, and huddled close to their fires when the shadows grew long. But in those shadows lurked something older, something hungrier, something that knew neither rest nor mercy. The Orks. They were unlike any other creatures that walked the land. Their skins glowed with the sickly green of rot and moss. Their tusks jutted from snarling jaws. Their eyes burned red like coals, and their laughter echoed like the beating of war drums. Where men tilled the earth and dwarves delved the mountains, the Orks lived only to fight. War was not a necessity for them. It was their nature, their prayer, their joy. The Orks did not build cities, nor raise monuments. They did not plant nor craft, save for weapons of crude stone and bone, later bound in iron, stolen from their victims. They existed for battle alone. Their tribes rose and fell in endless cycles of violence, fighting each other when no other prey could be found. But when they turned their gaze outward, the world shook. The first true memory of the Orks in human history is tied to the fall of Theralon, a city of white stone, famed for its towering walls and unbreakable iron gates. For generations, men had called it the Jewel of the North. Its walls had defied raiders, wild beasts, even the harsh winters of the North. But all fortresses fall eventually, and none can withstand the tide of green. On the eve of the new moon, the watchers on Theralon's walls heard it first, a sound like distant thunder, rolling across the forest. Drums, war drums. Then came the glow of torches, thousands of them, swaying between the trees like a sea of fire. And then the roar, not the voices of men, not the cries of beasts, but a single, thunderous bellow that shook the very stones. Wog. The Orks surged from the woods like a living wave. Crude axes flashed in the firelight, jagged spears thrust forward, and their war cries filled the night. The men of Theralon rained arrows down upon them, but the Orks only laughed as shafts pierced their flesh. They smashed against the gates with clubs and hammers, heedless of death, reveling in the chaos. By dawn, the gates of Theralon lay shattered. The Orks poured into the city, and blood ran through its streets. Fires climbed the white towers. Screams echoed in every alley. By the next night, the Jewel of the North was nothing but ash and ruin. its survivors dragged in chains to serve as slaves or as sport, and the name of the Orks was carved into human memory forever. Yet, Theralon was not the end. It was only the beginning, for in the chaos of that slaughter, a single figure rose among the tribes. His name would become a curse whispered across the land, a nightmare that mothers use to silence their children, a terror that no blade or spell could extinguish. Gorgrim was not the largest of the Orks at first, nor the strongest, but when his chieftain fell beneath a rival's hammer, Gorgrim seized the weapon and struck down the enemy in a single bone-crushing blow. The Orks around him roared their approval, and from that moment he was leader. With every battle, his legend grew. With every skull he split, his horde swelled. Gorgrim did not fight for food or plunder. He fought for war itself. He spoke roared of a dream, a world where all tribes would unite into one unstoppable tide, where every man, dwarf, and elf would fall before the green tide. He promised the Orks endless battle, endless bloodshed, endless laughter in the face of death. And the Orks believed him. That belief gave them power, a strange and terrifying force. When Gorgrim told his warriors to paint their armor red because red made them faster, they became faster. When he roared that no gate could withstand them, walls that had stood for centuries crumbled at their charge. It was not magic as men knew it. It was the will of the Orks made real. And so the first true WoG began. The prologue ends with this. The kingdoms of men trembled. The dwarves sealed their gates. The elves prepared their ancient spells. But no army could truly prepare for the storm that was coming. For Gorgrim's Skullsplitter had risen, and with him rose the dream of endless war. The green tide had awoken, and the world would never be the same. The birth of Gorgrim. The Orks were born of violence, and in violence they thrived. Their tribes roamed the northern forests and broken hills, fighting endlessly among themselves. Chiefs rose and fell with the swing of an axe. Strength was the only law. It was in this brutal world that Gorgrim first opened his eyes. He was not born beneath the stars like most of his kind, nor among the firelit chants of victory. His birth came in the aftermath of a raid, when his tribe lay bloodied and broken. The cries of battle still echoed in the night when Gorgrim's first wail split the air. Perhaps it was a sign, though the Orks of his tribe were too busy licking wounds to notice. Even as a youngling, Gorgrim was restless. Other Orklings squabbled and bit, content with small victories. But Gorgrim's eyes burned with something more. When the others slept, he sharpened stones. When they played, he tested his strength against trees and beasts. His laughter came not from games, but from the crunch of bone beneath his fists. The elders muttered that he was strange, too focused, too hungry. But in a world of Orks, where hunger and rage were the measure of greatness, such strangeness was not weakness, it was destiny. Gorgrim's true beginning came during a hunt. His tribe had cornered a great horned beast in the forest. The creature was massive, its hide thick as armor, its horns sharp as spears. Warriors surrounded it, shouting and jeering, hurling spears that bounced harmlessly from its hide. When the beast charged, the Orks scattered. One warrior fell, impaled on its horn. Another was trampled into the dirt. Fear rippled through the tribe, but not Gorgrim. Though he was barely grown, his body lean and untested. He seized a fallen spear and charged the beast head-on. The orcs shouted at him to stop, but his roar drowned them out. He dodged the first horn, rolled beneath the beast's neck, and with a savage cry, he drove the spear upward into its throat. The beast thrashed, bellowed, and fell. Gorgrim rose from beneath its bulk, drenched in blood, his teeth bared in triumph. The tribe stared in stunned silence. Then, as one, they roared approval. From that day, Gorgrim was no longer just another orc. He was a warrior, and warriors followed strength. The challenge of chiefs. In the orc tribes, leadership was never inherited. A chief ruled only as long as he was the strongest. When another rose to challenge him, the tribe gathered in a great circle to watch. So it was that Gorgrim, still young, stood before the chief of his tribe, a massive brute named Thrag. Throg had led for years, his skull necklace rattling with the trophies of dozens of kills. Few dared oppose him, but Gorgrim dared. The two faced each other in the circle. Around them, the orcs howled and beat drums of hide and bone. Thrag swung first, his hammer crashing down like thunder. Gorgrim dodged, quick as a wolf, the ground splitting where the blow landed. He countered with his own strike, a crude club of stone. It struck Thrag's side with such force that the chief stumbled, rage twisting his face. The duel raged, blow for blow, until Thrag raised his hammer high for a killing strike. In that instant, Gorgrim lunged, seizing the chief's wrist with one hand and his jaw with the other. With a roar that echoed through the forest, he tore Thrag's head from his shoulders. The tribe erupted in frenzy. They beat the ground, howled at the sky, and shouted Gorgrim's name. From that day, he was no longer a youngling. He was boss. Most orc chiefs were content with raids and feasts. They fought rival tribes, took slaves, and bathed in blood. But Gorgrim was not like the others. Around the fire, his followers would chant and boast. But Gorgrim would rise and speak. His voice was raw and thunderous, his words crude but heavy with power. "Dis ain't enough," he growled one night. Flames dancing across his tusked grin. Fightin' each other, fightin' for scraps. We is orcs, we is made for more. The world is big full of humies, stunties, and pointier. All o' dem waiting to be crumped. Not just a tribe, not just a fight, but all fights forever. Endless war. The orcs bellowed with joy. His dream was their dream, though none had dared to speak it before. They painted their faces red, marked their weapons with blood, and pledged themselves to Gorgrim's vision. For the first time, the scattered tribes began to gather, drawn by the promise of endless battle. The first Wog. It began with raids on human villages, swift and merciless. Huts burned, crops trampled, and every survivor was dragged away in chains. Word spread quickly. A new orc war boss had risen, fiercer than any before. Then came the fortress of Dornhold, whose walls had stood for centuries. Men laughed at the idea that orcs could breach them. But when Gorgrim arrived, he did not waste time with ladders or siege engines. He walked to the gates, raised his great stone club, and roared, "This gate is mine." The orcs roared with him, the sound shaking the very earth. And then, impossibly, the iron gates cracked not from any weapon, but from the sheer force of orc belief, fueled by Gorgrim's will. With a single swing, he shattered them. The orcs poured in, and Dornhold burned by dawn. Thus began the legend of Gorgrim Skullsplitter, the orc who dreamed of more, and whose dream turned into a tide of blood and fire. The world had seen raids before. It had endured plagues and invasions. But this was something else. This was the birth of the first true. They came by the hundreds, then the thousands. Orcs from the deep woods, from the frozen hills, from the ruined swamps where few dared tread. They brought with them crude weapons, stolen armor, and slaves bound in chains. Gorgrim stood before them all, towering and broad, his tusks gleaming in the firelight. His voice carried like thunder as he bellowed, "This world is ours. Da humies build walls, da stunties hide in caves, da pointiers sing songs. But we is da fitten, we is da, we is dawa." The horde roared with him, the sound so great that trees shook and birds fled from the forest. From that night onward, there were no more tribes. There was only the horde of Gorgrim Skullsplitter. The fortress of Dornhold stood as the northern kingdom's pride. Built on a rocky hill, its walls were thick stone, its gates forged of black iron, its garrison well armed and trained. For centuries, it had defied invaders. When word reached the men of Dornhold that orcs were gathering, they prepared. Archers lined the walls. Spears were stacked high. The Lord of Dornhold declared that his fortress would hold against any rabble of beasts. But Gorgrim was no rabble. The orcs marched out of the woods, their drums pounding, their torches blazing. The ground shook beneath their charge. Men on the walls looked out and saw not a band of raiders, but a sea of green stretching as far as the eye could see. Arrows flew. Dozens of orcs fell. But for every one that dropped, 10 more surged forward, laughing and roaring. They smashed against the gates, hacking with axes, battering with logs. The defenders poured boiling oil, hurled stones, and thrust spears from above. Still, the orcs did not falter. And then Gorgrim appeared. He strode through the ranks, his massive club in hand, blood already dripping from the foes he had crushed along the way. He stood before the gate and raised his weapon high. "This gate is mine," he roared. The orcs roared back, their voices like a storm. And then something impossible happened. The iron groaned. Cracks spread across its surface. The very stones of Dornhold trembled. With a single swing, Gorgrim shattered the gate. The horde poured in like a flood. Streets ran red. Houses burned. The defenders fought bravely, but they were drowned beneath the tide of green. By dawn, Dornhold was ash. Its fall sent shockwaves across the kingdoms. For the first time, men realized the orcs were not just a nuisance. They were a plague, and Gorgrim was its herald, the march south. With Dornhold destroyed, Gorgrim's horde swept south. Villages were abandoned before they arrived. Fields were left to rot. Cities sealed their gates, hoping to outlast the storm. But Gorgrim had no need for siege engines. Wherever he went, walls cracked, gates shattered, and fear did the rest. At every fire, Gorgrim promised his followers more. More blood, more skulls, more endless battle. His vision became their faith. They painted themselves red, believing it made them faster. They tied bones to their weapons, believing it made them stronger. And somehow, terrifyingly, it worked. The orcs' belief shaped reality. What they roared, the world obeyed. The alliance of the 7 hills. Desperate to stop the tide, the kingdoms united. 3 human kings brought their armies together, joined by dwarves from the mountain halls and elves from the southern woods. Their banners filled the fields, their armor gleamed in the sun. At the heart of the land lay the 7 hills, where the armies gathered to make their stand. They believed that united they could break the green tide, but belief was the Orks' greatest weapon. When Gorgrim crested the hills, with his horde of thousands of Orks roaring in unison, the very earth shook. The kings trembled, though they stood tall. The battle began with arrows that blotted out the sky. Elven shafts pierced orc flesh, dwarf crossbows cracked bone, human spears braced against the charge. But the orcs laughed as they fell, trampled by their own kind, the tide never slowing. The clash was thunderous. Steel rang against bone, shields splintered, axes split skulls. Blood soaked the hills until they ran red. For 3 days and nights the battle raged. Men fought bravely, dwarves stood firm, elves sang their deadly songs, but the orcs were endless. On the dawn of the 4th day, Gorgrim entered the fray himself. His club rose and fell like a hammer of the gods. Knights shattered beneath him. Dwarves were cast aside. Elves were crushed like twigs. His laughter rolled across the field, terrible and triumphant. When the first of the kings fell, the alliance wavered. When the second was crushed, the line broke. When the 3rd king tried to flee, Gorgrim split him in 2 with a single blow. The survivors scattered. The 7 hills were lost, and Gorgrim's name became legend. What the men, dwarves, and elves never understood was that orcs were more than just brutes. They were belief made flesh. Their laughter, their roars, their endless hunger for battle, it gave them power. When Gorgrim declared that red paint made them faster, their chariots and beasts outran horses. When he claimed no wall could stand before them, fortresses collapsed. When he roared that the orcs could not die, the fallen rose again, laughing, eager for more. The more they believed, the stronger they became, and with Gorgrim leading them, their belief became unshakable. The first walk was no mere invasion. It was a storm of faith and fury, a tide that no mortal power could withstand. The kingdoms were broken. The dwarves had sealed their halls. The elves had vanished into their woods. But Gorgrim was not finished. The orcs had tasted true war, and their hunger was endless. This was only the beginning. The green tide was rising, and the world had only just begun to drown. The War of the 7 Hill. The kingdoms of men had seen many wars in their time, but none like the storm that fell upon them with Gorgrim's Skullsplitter's rise. Raiders and beasts had plagued their borders before, yet these had always been threats that could be contained. Skirmishes that faded with the seasons. The orcs under Gorgrim were something else entirely. They were not a rabble. They were not a nuisance. They were a tide, and tides could not be reasoned with, nor bribed, nor halted by walls. Thus it was that the kings of men, the lords of and the high captains of the elves forged a desperate alliance. They met beneath the banners of the 7 Hills, a stretch of rolling earth at the crossroads of kingdoms. From those heights, one could see far in every direction, and there the lords swore that they would make their stand. Their banners snapped in the wind, bright against the storm-darkening sky. Knights polished their steel, Dwarves sharpened their axes. Elves sang songs of courage that floated like whispers across the field. Atop the highest hill stood 3 thrones of command, where the 3 kings of men sat in grim silence. Each had sworn to hold their ground to the last breath, but oaths and banners were not enough to stop what was coming. The approach of the green tide. The first sign of the horde was the smoke, a thick black haze rising from the north, carrying with it the scent of burning forests. Then came the drums, deep, thunderous beats that rattled the bones of every man and beast who heard them. And finally came the roar, Wog. It rolled across the hills like thunder, shaking the very earth. Men gripped their spears tighter. Horses reared and snorted, sensing what their riders tried to deny. Even the elves faltered in their song, their voices trembling. And then they appeared. The orcs spilled from the tree line in an endless tide of green and black. Torches flared. Rusted blades gleamed. Their armor was a patchwork of iron, leather, and bone, scavenged from every victim they had slain. Some rode snarling beasts, others dragged crude chariots splattered with blood, and all roared with manic glee. At their head was Gorgrim. He stood taller than any man, broader than any dwarf, his skin a deep, scarred green. His tusks jutted like ivory daggers, and his eyes burned red with hunger for battle. In his hands he carried his great club, blackened with dried blood and splintered bone. He raised it high, and the horde fell silent. "This land is ours," he bellowed, his voice echoing across the hills. "Da humies, da stunties, da pointiers, all of them. We is da fightin'. We is da Wog." The silence shattered into a deafening roar as tens of thousands of orcs surged forward, a living storm of fury and steel. The defenders loosed their arrows first. Elven shafts rained down in perfect precision, piercing through armor and hide. Dwarven crossbows thudded, bolts cracking skulls and snapping spines. Human archers fired volley after volley, darkening the sky. Orcs fell in heaps, but the tide did not break. For every one cut down, 10 more surged over their corpse, laughing even as blood spilled from their wounds. Some pulled arrows from their flesh and hurled them back in defiance, roaring with mad glee. The first wave crashed against the shield wall of men at the foot of the hills. Spears bristled, shields locked tight, and for a moment it seemed the line would hold. Orcs impaled themselves willingly, clawing at the spears, snapping shafts with bare hands. Their weight pressed harder and harder until the shields buckled, and then the line broke. The hill shook with the thunder of combat. Steel clashed with bone, axes hacked through helms, war cries mixed with screams. The ground grew slick with blood. At dawn, the hills were already stained red. Corpses lay in heaps, orc and man alike, their blood soaking into the earth. Yet the battle had only begun. The alliance fought fiercely. Dwarves formed unbreakable phalanxes, their shields interlocked, their axes biting deep. Elves darted through the fray like shadows, their blades flashing, their arrows never missing their mark. Human knights charged from the flanks, lances shattering orc ranks in thunderous strikes. But the orcs were endless. When one fell, another leapt over him. When ranks were broken, they reformed with laughter. Their belief in their own victory was so absolute that the Worlds seemed to bend to their will. Blades that should have shattered bit deeper. Armor that should have broken held strong. And always, above the carnage, Gorgrim's laughter rolled like thunder. He waded into battle like a storm given flesh, his club swinging in arcs that crushed men, dwarves and elves alike. No weapon seemed to harm him. Arrows bounced from his hide. Blades glanced from his flesh. To the Orks, he was not just a war boss. He was a god. By nightfall, the defenders still held the central hills, but at terrible cost. Their numbers were thinning. Their courage wavered, and the Orks only grew louder, stronger, hungrier. On the third day, Gorgrim struck at the heart. The Orks charged the central hill where the three kings stood with their banners. Knights encircled them, shields high, but Gorgrim smashed through as if they were straw. His club shattered shields, splintered bones, and hurled armored men through the air like ragdoll. The first king fell beneath that club, his chest crushed to ruin. The Orks roared in triumph. The second king met Gorgrim with a greatsword blessed by elven mages. He struck true, cleaving deep into Gorgrim's side, but the Ork only laughed, ripping the blade free with his bare hand before splitting the king's skull in two. The third king tried to flee. His knights formed a desperate shield around him, but Gorgrim cut through them like grass. With one final blow, he split the last king from shoulder to hip. As the royal banner fell, so too did the courage of men. The alliance crumbled. Dwarves retreated toward the mountains. Elves vanished into the woods, and the armies of men scattered to the wind. The seven hills were drowned beneath the green tide. For 3 days, the Orks feasted among the corpses. Fires burned high, roasting the flesh of their enemies. Skulls were piled into great pyramids, offerings to Gorgrim's vision of endless war. Yet even in victory, Gorgrim was not satisfied. As his horde roared in triumph, he stood upon the highest hill, gazing southward, where new lands awaited. His body was smeared with blood, his tusks gleaming, his laughter echoing across the night. "Dis is only da start," he growled. "Da wog. Don't end ere we take it all. We fight till dere's nothin' left to fight. Dis world." And so the War of the Seven Hills passed into legend. To men, it was a tragedy, a tale of kingdoms lost and heroes slain. To dwarves, it was a warning carved into stone. To elves, it was a lament, a sorrowful song whispered through the trees. But to the Orks, it was a beginning, the first great victory of Gorgrim Skullsplitter, the birth of a dream that would consume the world.